Yo, what's up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. It's Thursday evening. This is No Huddle Fantasy Sports, and to kick off Week 11 NFL right, we're talking top, best defensive matchups and spots that you can look to attack this week in fantasy football. And so, hey, it doesn't matter if you're a season-long or daily fantasy football player. I've got you covered in this video with the top defensive matchups, DVP data, and which players and teams are in the best spots in NFL Week 11 to make sure you succeed in all formats of fantasy football. If you can handle that and are ready for the best quality free information here on YouTube for fantasy football and want to dominate NFL Week 11, stay tuned. Hey guys, and welcome back to No Huddle Fantasy Sports and the Week 11 Notable Matchups video here on YouTube, where we cover the top 5 defenses versus every position in terms of amount of fantasy points given up to those positions. Basically, we're looking at defense versus position data to start the week off on the right foot and make sure we're prepared for which teams and which players are in the best spots on paper. Of course, before we get started, I got to thank you for taking the time to find this channel and click on this video. If you're new here or simply haven't done so already and you want to continue to support this channel and show me that these videos are worthwhile, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up because you're going to love it, and make sure you do hit that subscribe button. It's the easiest way for you guys to help support me, help support No Huddle Fantasy Sports, and of course support these videos. And finally here, it's always good for us to take a quick glance back at the previous week's defensive notes and see if there's anything that we can take away and learn from, in this case from Week 10. You can see here I've written down a couple of things, the first being Arizona continues to struggle against the pass. Even with Patrick Peterson back in their defensive secondary, they surrendered 358 passing yards last week, and over the last 3 games they've averaged 350 plus passing yards per game given up to opposing quarterbacks. So again, a good defense you can target week in and week out with opposing quarterbacks. Minnesota, surprisingly, even though they're a really good defense, they've struggled against quality quarterbacks. Last week they gave up 397 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. And if you go back to the games in which they showcase that they're a good defense, for the most part, they've been against lower quality quarterbacks. So finally, when they've been up against someone like Dak Prescott last week, a quality quarterback, they've been getting kind of shredded through the air. So keep that in mind moving forward. Carolina, they've struggled week in and week out against the rush and continued to do so last week, giving up 163 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns to Aaron Jones, and I think Williams was also playing in that game for Green Bay. And last week that amounted to a 6.0 rushing per carry average, which is just awful for any defense in general. Kansas City, same note. They are really struggling against the run. They allowed 225 plus rushing yards last week and 2 touchdowns. That amounted to an 8.7, an ungodly 8.7 rushing yards per attempt average. So you can continue to attack Carolina and Kansas City with almost any form of running back. And finally here, Tampa Bay, they struggled really bad over the last couple of weeks against outside receivers in particular. Their defense has been good against the run, but in general, not very good against the pass. And if we narrow that down even more, you can see outside receivers are really having field days against them. Last week, 138 yards given up and 3 touchdowns given up to outside receivers, and the week prior 152 yards and 2 touchdowns given up. So do not be afraid to stack any form of outside receiver against Tampa Bay at the moment. And so with all of that covered, let's jump right into the quarterback outlook for NFL Week 11. You can see here the top 5 teams in terms of points given up to the quarterback position currently are Arizona, Tampa Bay, Cincinnati, Atlanta, and Oakland. All these teams we've seen week after week, whether it's shifting from first to second or within this top 5, but universally these teams continue to show up and continue to be weak against quarterbacks. Arizona faces off against San Francisco this week and Jimmy Garoppolo, so he's clearly in a good spot. On DraftKings, giving up over 25 points per game, and on FanDuel, giving up nearly 24 points per game. So Arizona certainly someone you can attack, or a defense you can attack with Jimmy Garoppolo. Tampa Bay, I already mentioned how much they struggle against outside receivers, so naturally quarterbacks are in a good spot, and they face off against one of the best this weekend in Drew Brees. Cincinnati, third on the list here. The only caveat, they're clearly a weak defense. They struggle against all aspects of offenses, but they're third, and I think they could actually be a few spots lower. If you figure right now they've played Lamar Jackson twice, who has just absolutely murdered that defense. And that includes, obviously, for him, rushing yards against them. Not every quarterback's going to perform in that same manner. So Cincinnati, yes, they are a very weak defense, a defense you can exploit with almost any position, including quarterbacks. But I don't believe third is an accurate indicator of where they are in terms of fantasy points given up to quarterbacks. Moving forward here, we have Atlanta listed at number 4, facing off against Carolina and Kyle Allen, who's in a great spot against Atlanta, giving up 23 plus on DraftKings, 22 plus on FanDuel. And finally here, rounding out the top 5 garbage defenses versus quarterbacks, we have Oakland, of course, giving up nearly 23 on DraftKings and 22 plus on FanDuel. They face off against Cincinnati. Not a great spot in terms of someone you might want to pick, but Finley and Cincinnati technically in a good spot against this Oakland defense. Up next, of course, we have the running back outlook for NFL Week 11 and the 5 teams giving up the most amount of points to running backs so far in 2019 on a per-game average. Detroit, Cincinnati, Carolina, Miami, and Washington. Detroit, of course, just not letting go at this number 1 spot, a team that you can attack week in and week out with running backs. Right now giving up over 31 points on DraftKings and nearly 28 points per game on FanDuel to running backs. Face off against the Cowboys and Ezekiel Elliott. Elliott in a great spot, a spot you can't pass up. One of the best spots for him on the entire season. So again, just a great spot for Elliott in a spot you can attack against Detroit. Cincinnati, another team that you can just continuously fit running backs against and expect big things, giving up nearly 30 on DraftKings and 26 plus on FanDuel. Josh Jacobs in Oakland in a great spot, more so than I think Derek Carr. I would rather take Josh Jacobs against that defense that simply cannot stop the rush. Up third here, we have Carolina, a team we talked about from our notes that gave up over 160 rushing yards last week and multiple touchdowns to running backs. They face off against Atlanta, of course. Unfortunately, Freeman is hurt for Atlanta, their main running back, so we have to deal with a backup in Hill, but he did get 20-plus carries last week in a good spot, both a value in terms of waiver wire pickups and season long, and if you're looking for DFS, a value play, Hill is in a good spot against this weak rush Carolina defense. Miami, a team coming off a surprising week, but traditionally is trailing in most games and thus gives up a ton of yardage and a ton of points to running backs. Face off against the Bills this weekend in Singletary. So Singletary and Frank Gore, I guess you could consider too, in a great spot against a very, very weak Miami rush defense. And rounding out the top 5 teams that give up the most amount of points to running backs, we have Washington here facing off against the Jets and Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell has been a bit of a struggle this year, but over the last couple of weeks, since talking to Adam Gase and their general offense, he's gotten a lot more involvement. So Le'Veon Bell, of course, you're going to play him in season long, but if you're looking at DFS, in a great spot against a very weak Washington defense versus the running back position. Moving on to the wide receiver outlook for NFL Week 11, we have 5 teams here: Tampa Bay, New York Jets, Houston, Minnesota, and Atlanta. Rounding out those teams that are playing this weekend and give up the most amount of points versus wide receivers. Tampa Bay already talked about how bad they are against quarterbacks, so naturally they're giving up a lot of points to wide receivers, giving up a ridiculous 48 points on DraftKings, 40 plus on FanDuel. And if you just look at this straight here, they're the number 1 team. Number 2 is the New York Jets, who are giving up 43 and 35 respectively. So you have Tampa Bay here giving up 5 more points on both PPR sites and half-point PPR versus the second worst team in the NFL. So Tampa Bay, clearly a team you can attack. I already mentioned how good of a spot Drew Brees was in, so naturally the best, one of the most consistent receivers in the NFL, Michael Thomas, in an incredible matchup. And of course you have other players like Ted Ginn in a good spot. I mentioned number 2 was the New York Jets. They face off against Washington. Dwayne Haskins is playing quarterback, so don't be too super tempted with this matchup, but you have McLaren, Richardson, and Quinn for Washington here. Third on the list here, we have the Houston Texans in a game against the Baltimore Ravens, a game I expect to be very exciting, a fun game to watch. But nonetheless, the Baltimore Ravens wide receivers of Brown, Boykin, and Snead are all in a great spot against I would call it a pass funnel type of defense in the Houston Texans. Minnesota is number 4 on the list here, and it's a bit surprising to me. I've considered them a pretty quality, good defense overall, but I've talked about them in the notes, and I think they've been a little bit disguised this season, playing some pretty poor quarterbacks. But when they've played good quarterbacks, such as Dak Prescott last week, they've been pretty much weak against the pass, and that is showing now as they are number 4 in terms of points given up to wide receivers. They've given up 41 plus on DraftKings, 33 plus on FanDuel. Of course, they play the Denver Broncos. Not the greatest set of wide receivers, but certainly Sutton and Hamilton are in a good spot against a top 5 defense, and for points given up to wide receivers. And finally here, rounding out the top 5 weakest defense versus wide receivers, we have Atlanta giving up 40 plus on DraftKings, 33 plus on FanDuel. I love some Carolina receivers this weekend. You have Moore and Samuel, who have just had a great connection with Allen since he's taken over at quarterback. So again, a great matchup for both those guys and other receivers for the Carolina Panthers against a very weak Atlanta secondary. And finally, the position everybody loves to hear, the whole reason why you've tuned into this video, because you want to know which defenses are giving up the most amount of points at tight end. I know, that's exactly why you clicked on this video, and I'm here to tell you it's the Arizona Cardinals at number 1. Is that a surprise? Well, it shouldn't be, because they've been on this list, I think, every single week since week 1. They give up a ridiculous amount of yards, catches, touchdowns, 2 tight ends. They do face off against the San Francisco 49ers this weekend, and of course, George Kittle would be in an incredible spot against them, but unfortunately, he's injured. He's been out and in, so I'm not really sure. I'm going to go ahead and say he's probably out this weekend, but their backup tight end, of course, Dwelly, is in a good spot. He did have 7 targets last week, so a guy you can consider against Arizona's defense, who gives up 21 plus on DraftKings, 17, nearly 18 points on FanDuel to tight ends. Tampa Bay second on the list here. You have them facing off against the New Orleans Saints. Cook is in a good spot, of course, against them. Dallas Cowboys, I think they've been on this list for a few weeks now, so clearly a weakness of their defense is a tight end matchup. TJ Hawkinson for the Detroit Lions is in that matchup this weekend, so you could look to him should you need to. For Oakland, another team rounding out the top 5 here, against Cincinnati, Tyler Eifert, I probably hate him. I played him a couple times this year in good spots, and he's failed me. But nonetheless, he's in a good spot against Oakland, giving up nearly 16 on DraftKings, 13 plus on FanDuel to tight ends. Finally, here we have the Chicago Bears. They are giving up the 5th most amount of points in the NFL on a weekly average to the tight end position, with 15 plus on DraftKings and nearly 12 points per game on FanDuel. They face off against the LA Rams in LA. I actually don't mind Everett this weekend. He's turning into a quality tight end, especially with them missing the Rams, that is, missing Cooks. He seems to have, I guess, eaten up a little bit of a bigger role. So Everett in a good spot for the Rams against a top 5 defense, or top 5 weakest defense in the Chicago Bears. And so there you have it. We've wrapped up our No Huddle Fantasy Sports Week 11 Notable Matchups video here on YouTube. There are certainly a number of interesting spots as we enter this week's slate of games. Of course, though, this is just the beginning of the week. This is how I personally, and I recommend you, start your weekly research off with defense versus position data. This certainly isn't the only thing you should rely on, but it does help you sort the clutter and figure out which players, which offenses, which teams in general are in good spots on paper. Of course, if I'm missing anything, whether it's injuries or information regarding matchups, and you think there's other players and other spots that I haven't mentioned that can be exploited in Week 11, let me know down in the comments below. Let's build this community, let's help each other out, and let's make sure we dominate NFL Week 11 fantasy football. And finally, I do hope you guys do get some benefit out of this. I always, of course, provide the full list, teams 1 through 32, defense versus position matchup data. Those sheets are linked in the description below. Print those out, use them to your benefit. They're absolutely free. You don't have to provide an email or anything. You just simply click the link down below in the description, and you'll have all 4 positional sheets, and you'll have every defense updated, ranked in terms of points given up to the position. And to wrap things up here, if you guys are getting benefit from this and you want to help support this channel, all I ask you to do is please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and make sure to give a thumbs up. You guys certainly have been the best so far. I'm real excited about NFL Week 11, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video.